He was a predator with no predictable pattern. He planned each murder cleverly and left behind few traces. He outsmarted the nation's top investigators from the FBI and slipped through their fingers time and time again. He was a ghost, a phantom who lived among us, committing murders with a cold, calculated precision. And it all started with Samantha. Samantha Koenig was an 18-year-old barista working at the Common Grounds coffee kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska. Like many young people, she was filled with dreams and ambitions and eager to carve her path in life. She had recently graduated from high school and, though unsure of the specifics of her future, had found comfort in a job she loved. She was outgoing, with a warm and kind attitude that earned her the affection of her friends, family, and customers. Samantha shared a close bond with her father, James Koenig, and had a tight-knit circle of friends who adored her cheerful and caring nature. But life was about to change for her. On February 1st, 2012, she worked her usual evening shift at the coffee stand, as she had countless times before. The coffee stand was a local hub, open 24 hours to serve customers who worked late shifts or simply needed a late-night pick-me-up. As usual, the small kiosk was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, its steady rhythm creating a sense of normalcy in Samantha's day. It was around 8 p.m. when she was behind the window preparing drinks and greeting customers, making her Americano for the next patron in line. There was nothing unusual about the evening, but for Samantha, this night was about to take a turn she could never imagine. A man approached the window. He was dressed casually, his presence nothing out of the ordinary for a late-night customer at a coffee kiosk. He placed his order, and as Samantha handed him his drink, he unexpectedly raised a gun, pointing it directly at her. For a split second, she probably thought it was a joke or some kind of misunderstanding. But as the reality of the situation set in, the air thickened with fear. The man, with an unsettling calmness, instructed Samantha to turn off the lights and to hand him the money from the cash register. It wasn't immediately clear what his intentions were. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine robbery, a fleeting encounter that could be settled with compliance and a bit of fear. Samantha, ever the professional, likely thought if she just followed his instructions, she would be unharmed and back home by the end of her shift. But as she moved to comply, turning off the lights and reaching for the register, the situation escalated in a way that Samantha could have not anticipated. The man, with an eerie swiftness, didn't just remain outside the window. He jumped through it. In an instant, he was inside the kiosk, grabbing hold of her before she could even react. His movements were quick, almost predatory, and the fear Samantha must have felt in that moment was likely overwhelming. Within seconds, she was overpowered, her hands bound. There was no escape. The man had come prepared, his actions premeditated, each step deliberate. What had started as a seemingly random interaction, as simple as handing over a coffee, had now turned into something much darker. He wasn't here for money. He wasn't just looking for a quick escape. Samantha was no longer a barista at a coffee stand. She was a victim, caught in the hands of a man who had been planning this moment long before she ever saw his face. What happened next was the result of careful planning, a disturbing realization that Samantha was not a random target, but part of a broader, more chilling strategy. The man didn't hesitate. He didn't give her a chance to think or plead. He simply dragged her out of the kiosk and into his car. The cold air, the dark night, and the isolation of the location probably hit Samantha like a shockwave as she was pulled from her familiar surroundings into a world of unknown terror. 1 minute, she had been safely behind the counter, surrounded by the comforting clink of coffee cups at the hum of the small familiar establishment. The next minute, she was alone, trapped in a stranger's car with no way to predict what would happen next. It happened so quickly that her mind may have not had time to process what was truly happening. Was she kidnapped? Was she the victim of a random crime? The questions must have flooded her mind in that terrifying moment. No one ever expects something like this to happen to them. Not when they're simply doing their job in a small coffee shop late at night. But the man had already taken control of the situation. She was no longer just a barista. She was captive, and her fate was now entirely in his hands. For him, this wasn't just about robbery. This wasn't even about the money or the coffee stand. He had a different goal altogether, a cold, calculated motive that went far beyond simple theft. His actions were deliberate, his plans meticulous. He didn't just want to get in and out with cash. He wanted to disappear into the night with Samantha, to take her away from everything she knew and leave no trace behind. That wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of a long, simmering, carefully constructed plan. The fear Samantha must have felt in that moment is unimaginable. Fear of the unknown, fear of being taken against her will, and fear of what the man might want from her. But she had no way of knowing just how deep his plans went, nor did she know how long he had been preparing for a moment like this. For the man, this was a calculated move, a decision that had been years in the making. What followed was not just a random act of violence. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would reveal the depths of a man's darkness and expose a chilling pattern of premeditated brutality. Israel Keys, as we would later come to know him, was not just another criminal. He was a predator who had been meticulously planning his crimes, often years in advance. The robbery at the kiosk, the kidnapping of Samantha Koenig, was merely the first step in his greater, far more disturbing plan. At the time, no one knew just how far his reach extended or how many other lives he had already taken before this night. But for Samantha, this moment would be her last. She had no idea the man who stood before her, seemingly just another customer at the coffee window, was about to take her life and leave her family, friends, and community forever searching for answers. As the hour ticked by after Samantha Koenig disappeared from her shift at the Common Coffee Grounds kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska, the situation became increasingly unsettling for her family. For James Koenig, Samantha's father, this night started out like any other. He had planned to pick her up from work, but when he arrived at the coffee stand around 10 p.m., she was nowhere to be found. At first, he thought she was running late, or perhaps chatting with a friend after her shift. It wasn't uncommon for young people to linger a little longer at work or to make last-minute plans. But as time passed, something didn't feel right. James had always trusted Samantha. She was a reliable and responsible young woman. She was known for her friendly nature, her dedication to her job, and her strong relationship with her family. It wasn't like her to be unreachable, especially after her shift ended. James had grown used to Samantha's voice on the phone, or at the very least, a quick text. But as the minutes turned into hours and James tried calling her over and over, his concern began to rise. The phone rang with no response, and soon he had a sinking feeling in his stomach. Something was terribly wrong. He called and texted Samantha multiple times, hoping to hear from her. Nothing. His worry turned to fear. At that point, James was no longer waiting for a simple answer from his daughter. He knew something had happened to her. Samantha was always thoughtful about letting her family know where she was or keeping in touch, especially when it came to something as routine as her shift ending. Her sudden disappearance without a trace, without a word, was completely out of character. It felt like something had yanked her from the safe, familiar world she had known, a place she had always felt comfortable. By the early hours of February 2nd, 2012, the situation had escalated to a full-blown crisis. Samantha was still missing, and there were no leads to her whereabouts. James had been frantically trying to reach her for hours, but there was still no response. He called everyone he could think of, hoping someone might have seen her or heard from her. He called her friends, her boyfriend, even the other employees at the kiosk, but no one had heard from her. The panic in his voice was evident as he realized that his daughter was truly gone. James immediately reported her missing to the police, making it clear that this wasn't like Samantha. She wasn't the type to just run off or disappear without telling anyone. The suddenness of it was the most unsettling thing. The absence of any clues or signs of where she had gone created an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. What could have happened? Where was she? The police, upon receiving the report, began their investigation. But initially, the case felt like many others, a missing persons case. The initial theory was that maybe Samantha had walked away, gotten into some kind of trouble, or had been with someone and didn't want her family to know. But those initial thoughts began to disappear as James and others began to share more details about Samantha's personality and life. Samantha was a level-headed, responsible young woman, deeply rooted in family values. Her absence was completely out of character. Everyone around her knew this. She had an active social life, but she kept close relationships with her family, especially her father, and always made sure she kept in touch with him. This wasn't someone who would just vanish. There was a deeper, more troubling reason for her disappearance, and it was only a matter of time before the truth began to surface. The investigation soon took a significant turn when the coffee kiosk security footage was reviewed. Samantha's father was among the first to see the footage that would eventually provide investigators with the first real clue in the case. CCTV footage captured the moments leading up to Samantha's abduction, and its contents would send chills down the spine of everyone involved in the investigation. The coffee stand, though small and local, had a security camera system. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was a lifeline in this case. The footage showed a masked man walking up to the kiosk window at around 8 p.m. He placed his order with Samantha, and like so many other customers before him, he appeared to be nothing out of the ordinary, nothing alarming about the way he acted. As Samantha turned to prepare his order, the man's face was particularly hidden, but his behavior seemed casual, even nonchalant. For a brief moment, everything seemed like a typical late-night exchange at a coffee stand. The moment of tension didn't come until Samantha handed the man his Americano. It was at that exact moment when the entire situation shifted. Instead of walking away with his coffee, the man suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it straight at her. The footage revealed this shocking moment with the man holding a firearm as he demanded Samantha comply with his orders. Samantha was completely caught off guard, and the panic in her eyes was visible as she froze for a second. But her training as a barista likely kicked in, and she did what she thought was best. She followed his instructions, turning off the lights and heading for the cash register. She had no reason to suspect that the situation was anything more than a robbery gone wrong, or that this man would take her from her place of work and trap her in a nightmare of fear and torment. As Samantha moved to comply with his demands, the man didn't stop at the robbery. He made his move quickly and without hesitation. Within moments, he jumped through the window of the kiosk, a swift and calculated maneuver that left Samantha no chance to react. She was quickly overpowered, and the camera captured her as she was dragged out of the kiosk, helpless and terrified. She didn't have time to scream or make any noises, let alone run. The footage from the CCTV showed how effortlessly the man overpowered her, dragged her away from the kiosk and into his car. The last frames of the footage were the most chilling. The final image shows Samantha being pulled across the parking lot with her body limp with fear as she was forced into a car by the man. There was no one else around, just an empty parking lot at a coffee kiosk and a terrified young woman who had just been thrust into a nightmare that would end in tragedy. After the initial police investigation into Samantha's disappearance yielded few leads, the FBI was quickly called in to assist with the case. The involvement of the FBI made it clear to everyone involved that the situation was far more serious than a typical missing persons case. They suspected this wasn't just a runaway situation or an accidental disappearance. This was a kidnapping and most likely a murder. The discovery of the CCTV footage confirmed their worst fears. It wasn't just a robbery. This was something far more disturbing. The masked man wasn't just taking money. He had come prepared for something far more sinister. He had planned the abduction of Samantha, and from that moment on, the investigation was no longer just about finding a missing young woman. It was now about tracking down a dangerous criminal, someone who had a method and a clear, chilling agenda. In the aftermath of her disappearance, Samantha's family and friends were left reeling. They had no answers. James Koenig felt helpless. His daughter, whom he had raised with so much love and care, was now out there somewhere, trapped in the hands of a man with unknown intentions. The search for Samantha was everywhere on social media, on TV, and even in the streets of Anchorage. Flyers with Samantha's photo and a description of her were passed out. The community rallied around the Koenig family, desperate to bring Samantha home. Her father held public press conferences, begging for any information about his daughter's whereabouts, pleading for the abductor to release her. But while the community searched high and low for Samantha, the man who had taken her was already miles away, having carefully orchestrated every step of his move. Israel Keys, the man responsible for Samantha's abduction, was playing his own game, a game that only he knew the rules to. As the search efforts intensified, and with the FBI's involvement, the realization began to settle in that this was not just a random disappearance. It was part of something far larger and more terrifying. Samantha's disappearance had triggered a chain of events that would lead to the unraveling of a deeply sinister and methodical criminal mastermind, Israel Keys. The search for Samantha was moving slowly, and her disappearance seemed like an ordinary missing persons case. However, everything changed when investigators were alerted to the use of Samantha's debit card, and the real horror of her abduction began to unfold. On February 2nd, 2012, Israel Keys made his first ATM withdrawal using Samantha's debit card. At first, the transaction seemed like another random act of a criminal trying to cover his tracks. Keys withdrew a relatively small amount of money from the card, just a few $100s. It was typical for criminals to take money from their victims' accounts, but what Keys didn't anticipate was how quickly investigators would react. The local authorities were closely monitoring the situation, and as part of their usual procedure, they began tracking Samantha's debit card activity. They quickly discovered that Samantha's card had been used in various ATM machines around Anchorage. Initially, the investigators didn't know who was behind the withdrawals, but the trail was starting to form. This would be the first real lead in the case, and it soon became apparent that the man who had abducted Samantha was someone who had not taken the necessary precautions to cover his tracks completely. The police and the FBI began analyzing the ATM footage. What they saw was chilling. The cameras revealed a man in disguise, wearing a hat and a scarf to conceal his face, but his movements were captured clearly enough to give law enforcement an idea of what they were dealing with. A man with a plan, and a level of composure that suggested he had done this before. Over the next several days, the trail of transactions took investigators on a chilling journey. Keys had left a trail that led him across state lines, away from Anchorage and into the lower 48 states. Israel Keys had been using Samantha's card to make multiple withdrawals, each time traveling further and further from Anchorage. They extended to locations in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, and it quickly became clear that this man was not staying in one place. His journey seemed methodical, almost as though he had a clear destination in mind. At first, investigators weren't sure if he was simply trying to evade detection or if there was another motive at play. As Keys traveled across the country, he left behind a series of clues, each one leading investigators closer to the truth. His meticulousness in covering his tracks showed how calculated he was, but it was the details of his movements, especially his use of cash and his disguise at ATM locations, that told a deeper, more unsettling story about who he was. Investigators, now aware that they were dealing with an experienced criminal, and they began to look for every possible clue that could reveal his identity. They immediately started to track the vehicle Israel Keys was using, one of his white Ford Focus cars that had been spotted at some of the ATM locations. And while his vehicle seemed like a straightforward lead, Keys was no amateur when it came to covering his tracks. He had removed the battery from his cell phone and paid for everything in cash, leaving no electronic traces behind. Yet, there were still details that Keys could not escape. The disguise he wore during the ATM withdrawals might have concealed his face, but his actions and behavior weren't so easy to hide. Investigators noted that his vehicle was spotted in various locations connected to the withdrawals. From Arizona to New Mexico and finally into Texas, the trail was expanding rapidly. Each time he stopped to withdraw cash, there was another opportunity for the police and the FBI to piece together his route. It was evident that Keys had traveled traveled to multiple cities to further his crime. The withdrawals were spread out over several days, and at each location, he was careful to use a different ATM. This wasn't a simple crime of opportunity. This was methodical and strategic. He knew exactly how to cover his tracks, ensuring that he had left as little evidence as possible. As the investigation intensified, federal authorities were able to pinpoint Keyes' route. Although he had been careful to take steps to avoid detection, surveillance footage from various ATMs showed a man wearing a disguise that could have been easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. Yet, the FBI was doing more than just tracking his debit card activity. They were working overtime to put together every detail they could find about his travel history, his methods, and, most importantly, his next move. As Keyes moved further from Alaska, investigators were left with only one major clue: the white Ford Focus. The vehicle became the key to tracking down Keyes, but it wasn't easy. Keyes was well aware of how difficult it could be for law enforcement to track him, and he took extreme measures to avoid detection. He used false identities, paid for everything in cash, and used burner phones to cover his tracks. Still, his one mistake was his reliance on his debit card theft, which ultimately led investigators to him. Even though he had done everything in his power to hide his tracks, he hadn't anticipated the constant movement of his cash trail. Every time he withdrew money, he left behind a clue, and the biggest clue was the white Ford Focus. The FBI and local law enforcement focused on the vehicle and began to search for any potential matches. Within hours, they were able to locate the rental agreement for the white Ford Focus, linking it to Keyes. It was clear that the man in the footage was in fact Israel Keyes, a man who had no ties to the case at that point. This was a game-changing discovery. It's one thing to know who the man behind the mystery is, it's another to actually catching the man. And that was the FBI's next step. Once the FBI had identified Israel Keyes as the suspect, they turned their attention to his movements. They began tracking his credit card usage and flight records, quickly realizing that the suspect had been on the move for days, if not weeks, after the abduction of Samantha Koenig. Keyes had traveled from Anchorage to various states across the U.S. using Samantha's debit card in multiple locations. With each transaction, the FBI was able to piece together Keyes' route, but he had been meticulous in covering his tracks. As mentioned before, Keyes used cash whenever possible, removed the battery from his cell phones, and made sure to use multiple different disguises during his ATM withdrawals. He had also been paying for his flights, hotel rooms, and rental cars in cash, further complicating the investigation. It seemed as if he had thought of everything in his plan to evade capture. Despite these precautions, the FBI's cybercrime division worked tirelessly to track the financial trail left by Keyes. The FBI began to realize that Keyes was not only using Samantha's card, but also traveling between multiple states and withdrawing money to fund his journey. The use of cash and debit cards seemed to be Keyes' only point of vulnerability, and the FBI was determined to close in on him. Keyes' composure and lack of urgency as he traveled across state lines would ultimately lead to his downfall. Despite his careful planning, Keyes made one fatal mistake: his driving behavior. His driving behavior caught the attention of a Texas Highway Patrol officer. The officer had no idea who he was stopping, but his keen instincts and attention to detail would change the course of the investigation forever. On March 3, 2012, Keyes was driving a white Ford Focus when he was pulled over for a routine traffic stop. The officer, Corporal Brian Henry of the Texas Highway Patrol, was aware of the car's description from the ongoing investigation. Began following Keyes. At first, there was nothing unusual about the stop until the officer noticed Keyes' uneasy demeanor. His behavior was off, and there was something suspicious about his nervousness when approached by the officer. When the officer asked for identification, Keyes provided a false name at first, but it didn't take long for the officer to confirm his true identity by running the details through the system. Once Keyes was identified as the suspect in Samantha Koenig's kidnapping, law enforcement conducted a thorough search of his vehicle. What they found inside was deeply revealing. It included Samantha's ID, her debit card, and her cell phone. The fact that these items were in his car was the first concrete evidence that linked Keyes to the kidnapping of Samantha Koenig. Samantha's phone was crucial, as it had been used in the days after her disappearance, and finding it in Keyes' car confirmed that he had her in his custody at some point. Keyes also had a gun in his car, which was a potential weapon used in the kidnapping and subsequent crimes. The presence of the gun raised further suspicions, as it indicated that Keyes had been prepared to use violence to subdue his victims. In addition to the weapon and personal items, disguises were found in the car. Keyes had been known to use disguises when committing crimes, including during the use of Samantha's debit card at various ATMs. His ability to change his appearance was one of the tactics he employed to avoid detection and help him evade the authorities. The car search provided significant evidence and made it clear that Israel Keyes had not only abducted Samantha Koenig, but also committed a series of other crimes that had yet to be fully uncovered. After this discovery, law enforcement began connecting more dots. They were able to track his travel history through the rental car and determine the route Keyes had taken while using Samantha's debit card. They also learned that he had used cash for transactions and removed the battery from his cell phone to avoid being tracked. After Israel Keyes' capture, the details of his chilling crimes began to unravel during his interrogation. The information provided by Keyes, though at times reluctant and evasive, painted a disturbing picture of events that led to the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig, and illuminated the horrifying extent of his criminal activities. What followed was a harrowing and painstaking investigation, during which law enforcement pieced together the facts, step by step, to reveal the true nature of Israel Keyes' dark and twisted world. Before February 1st, 2012, Keyes had carefully selected the Common Grounds coffee kiosk as the site for Samantha Koenig's abduction. He had surveyed other coffee stands in the area, but chose this one due to its location and because it was open later than most others. Samantha had no prior connection to Keyes. She was simply a convenient target. When Keyes arrived at the coffee kiosk just before closing time, he appeared like any other customer. He ordered a coffee, and Samantha, as friendly and as professional as ever, made the coffee and handed it to him. However, the moment she handed him the cup, everything changed. Keyes pulled out a gun and demanded money. Samantha, in a state of shock but understanding the situation, immediately complied. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare that Keyes had meticulously planned. He forced his way inside the kiosk, where he tied Samantha's hands with zip ties. Keyes, however, didn't just stop there. He was in full control, and his plan was unfolding with disturbing precision. He then asked Samantha where her car was, to which she replied that she didn't own one. This response didn't deter Keyes. He simply walked Samantha out of the coffee stand, guiding her toward Tudor Road. But in a split second, Samantha did something that surprised Keyes. She broke free and tried to run away. Keyes, however, was quicker. He chased her down, tackling her to the ground, and once he had her, he pointed the gun at her and demanded that she cooperate. He told her that the gun was equipped with a, quote, quiet ammo, meaning that she shouldn't make any noise or do anything that could prompt him to kill her. She had no choice but to comply. With one arm around Samantha's body, he used his free hand to hold the gun, and together they walked across Tudor Road into the parking lot in between the IHOP restaurant and Dairy Queen, where Keyes' white truck was parked. This was no coincidence. Keyes had already prepared his truck for the abduction. He had removed the mounted toolboxes from the bed and even removed the license plates from the truck to ensure it was untraceable as possible. After securing Samantha in the truck, Keyes drove her around Anchorage. As they drove, he explained to Samantha that this was a kidnapping for ransom. Samantha, understandably terrified, told him that her family didn't have much money. Keyes, however, reassured her that he would raise the ransom money by seeking the public's help. He promised that if Samantha Samantha complied, she would be returned to her family unharmed. Samantha was in a state of shock. She did what she could to engage with him, hoping that cooperating would lead to her safe return. Despite his careful planning, Keys encountered a problem during the abduction. Samantha didn't have her cell phone. This was a crucial mistake for Keys, as he needed the phone to make contact with her family for the ransom demand. The ransom text messages had to come from Samantha's phone in order to make it appear real. Keys, unwilling to leave any detail to chance, drove back to Common Grounds. He left Samantha bound in his truck while he entered the kiosk and retrieved her phone. Also took the opportunity to steal her debit card, and that was another vital part of his plan. Once back in the truck, Keys continued his drive. 2 text messages were sent from Samantha's phone. The first was to her boyfriend, and the second was to the owner of Common Grounds, making it seem like Samantha had a bad day and had decided to leave town for the weekend. This was a tactic Keys used to cover his tracks and make it look like Samantha had voluntarily left rather than having been kidnapped. To further ensure this plan would not be foiled, Keys took the battery out of Samantha's phone, preventing her from making any attempts to contact anyone. With the stage set, Keys' next move was to ask Samantha for her ATM debit card. Samantha, understandably terrified, told him that she had shared a bank account with her boyfriend and that his ATM card was in the truck they shared. Keys, now more confident in his control over the situation, demanded that Samantha tell him where her house was and provide the PIN number for the card. Samantha complied, providing him with the details of her address and the PIN number. Keys then drove her to a shed in front of his house where he bounded her and turned the radio on to drown out any sound she might make. He also informed her that he had a police scanner and would know if she tried to alert anyone or make any noise. Keys wasn't just about kidnapping Samantha for ransom. His control over her was part of a twisted desire to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He drove to Samantha's house to retrieve the ATM card. As he did so, he was confronted by Samantha's boyfriend, who noticed Keys near the truck. Samantha's boyfriend yelled at him, but Keys, maintaining his cool, quickly ran back to his vehicle and drove off before the boyfriend could gather any help. Once Keys was in the safety of his vehicle, he drove to an ATM to test the PIN number Samantha had given him. The transaction was successful, and he then returned to the shed where Samantha was held. This was an important point in the investigation, as it was the first confirmed link to Keys and Samantha's bank account. Samantha, now completely under his control, was sexually assaulted by Keys. Afterward, he took Samantha's life by strangling her in his shed. The entire time, Samantha had been attempting to engage with Keys, hoping that if she complied with his demands, he would ultimately release her. But that would never happen. The ransom wasn't enough for Keys. He wanted more than just money. He wanted to prove that he was untouchable. After Samantha's death, Keys then stashed her body in a shed while he went on a planned family vacation, a 2-week cruise in the Gulf of Mexico. Upon returning, he decided to stage a ransom photograph to make it appear as if she were still alive. Keys, ever the manipulator, applied makeup to Koenig's face, sewed her eyes open with a fishing line, and took a picture of her alongside a 4-day-old issue of the Anchorage Daily News to make it seem like she was still alive. Using her cell phone, Keys sent text messages, including a demand for a $30,000 ransom. Her family, hoping Koenig was still alive, deposited money into her account. Keys then made his way to Connors Bog Park, where he placed a ransom note under a missing dog flyer for a dog named Albert. The ransom demand was for $30,000, and the note was clear in its instructions to raise the money by depositing it into Samantha's bank account. He then texted Samantha's boyfriend about the note's location. While this was all unfolding, Samantha's family and friends were desperately trying to piece together her disappearance. They were completely unaware of the horrors that had already occurred and the cruel twist of fate that had led to Samantha's tragic end. After Samantha's body was disposed of, Keys took the debit card and made additional withdrawals from various ATMs. He traveled from Anchorage to Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas using Samantha's card. The FBI tracked these transactions and realized they were dealing with someone who was very likely experienced at evading capture. Eventually, Key's vehicle, the white Ford Focus, was identified and investigators were able to track its movements. But Keyes was careful. He used disguises and paid in cash to avoid detection. But fate had decided that this time there should be a full stop. After Israel Keyes' arrest, a critical part of the investigation unfolded when the authorities managed to locate Samantha Koenig's remains. Through a series of meticulous efforts by divers and investigators, the body was finally found. It was revealed that Samantha's body was discovered in Matanuska Lake, about 35 miles northeast of Anchorage. And that is a chilling location, far from where she had been seen. A dive team, with the help of specialized equipment, performed a thorough search of the icy waters. The discovery of the body occurred in the deep, cold depths of the lake, a place that would have made it nearly impossible for Samantha's remains to be found without diligent efforts. Police Chief Mark Mew addressed the public during a news conference, stating that investigators had successfully recovered the body and were performing forensic tests to confirm that it indeed belonged to Samantha Koenig. While divers conducted their search, investigators had already pieced together much of the timeline of events leading up to her tragic end. The team believed that Samantha had died within hours of her abduction on February 1st, shortly after being taken from the coffee stand where she worked. This was a crucial revelation, helping law enforcement understand just how quickly Keyes had moved to take her life, further cementing the calculated nature of his actions. As the investigation into Samantha Koenig's kidnapping and murder continued, law enforcement made it clear that formal charges would soon be forthcoming. However, the discovery of her remains, along with the details surrounding her abduction and the subsequent recovery of her body, brought a sense of closure to the investigation. Even though the larger case of Israel Keyes' other potential victims was still unfolding. Bill and Lorraine Courier were a middle-aged couple from Essex, Vermont. They had lived a relatively quiet, unassuming life. Bill, a former military man, had worked as a contractor, and Lorraine had worked at a local library. They were both described as kind, private people who enjoyed a peaceful life. Their disappearance in June of 2011 shocked the small Vermont community. The couple was last seen at their home, and despite extensive searches by local authorities, they were never found, and no clear evidence pointed to what had happened to them. At the time of their disappearance, the case stumped law enforcement. Investigators had no leads, and there were no signs of forced entry or a struggle at the Courier's home. It seemed as if the couple had simply vanished into thin air. The disappearance of two seemingly ordinary people from a quiet town raised questions and fears about what could have happened. However, it wasn't until Israel Keyes was arrested and confessed that the mystery of the Courier's fate began to unfold. Keyes had already established a pattern of manipulative behavior by the time he was interrogated about his crimes. He was not forthcoming with details, but would instead offer just enough information to keep investigators interested, often withholding key facts to prolong the investigation. When it came to the murder of Bill and Lorraine Courier, Keyes' manipulation of the investigation was particularly evident. He gave just enough information to help locate the remains of the couple, but intentionally left out crucial details that could have helped them solve their case more quickly. His initial confession about the Couriers was a twisted game of cat and mouse, where he offered vague and incomplete accounts of his actions, knowing that the investigators would have to dig deeper for the full story. Keyes was fully aware of the psychological manipulation at play. By providing only partial confessions, he maintained control over the investigation, forcing investigators to work harder to piece together the truth. Keyes revealed that he had planned the abduction of Bill and Lorraine Courier long before he actually executed it. He had been traveling across the United States, burying what he referred to as kits. They were pre-packaged bags containing weapons, money, and other tools he would need to commit his crimes. His methodical planning and careful selection of targets had become a signature of his criminal behavior. Keys admitted that he specifically targeted couples, finding it more rewarding to abduct and murder two people at once. The psychological control he could exert over couples as opposed to lone victims provided him with a sense of power and satisfaction. In the case of the Couriers, Keys had been stalking their home for quite some time. He knew their routines and had observed their neighborhood, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, he decided to make his move. He waited until the neighborhood was quiet and the couple was most likely asleep before breaking into their home. Keys explained that his preferred method of operation involved cutting the phone lines to ensure that his victims couldn't call for help. This, of course, would prevent any chance of them calling the police during the ordeal. Keys then used his standard tactics. He entered the Courier's home, woke them up, and forced them at gunpoint to lie down. He bound them with zip ties and told them that this was a robbery. The reasoning? To confuse the couple and keep them off balance. Keys made bizarre statements such as asking about money and drugs. He repeatedly told them that they were in the wrong house, hoping to mislead them and make them believe that this was a case of mistaken identity. Despite the Courier's confusion and fear, they complied with his orders. Bill, a former military man, was not someone who would easily back down from a confrontation, but his attempts to resist Keys were futile. Keys was physically larger and stronger, and the zip ties he used ensured that they could not escape or fight back effectively. His calm and controlling demeanor during this process made it clear that he was used to being in charge during these situations. Keys took his time, methodically collecting valuables and forcing the Couriers to believe that they were simply being held for ransom. However, things quickly escalated from a robbery to a brutal murder. After restraining the Couriers, Keys decided that they would have to die. He explained that he did not have any emotional connection to them. They were merely victims of his desire to kill. The randomness of the murder reflected his indifference to the lives of others. For Israel Keys, the thrill of the kill was more important than any motive, and he did not need a reason to take another life. Keys' confession revealed that he had planned to take on the Couriers to a drop-off point, making them think that they were being released after a ransom demand. However, as the night progressed, Keys grew increasingly frustrated with their questions and attempts to engage with him. This frustration culminated in violence. Bill, who had been struggling against his restraints, was eventually shot multiple times. His death was quick, but the violence of the attack reflected Keys' increasing rage and desire for control. Lorraine, who had been separated from her husband during the ordeal, was then taken upstairs where Keys would bound her in more intricate ways. The use of rope and other restraints reflected his need for control and domination over his victims. He then proceeded to sexually assault Lorraine, a crime that mirrored many of his other offenses. In his twisted mind, the act of violence and sexual assault was a way of asserting power and ownership over his victims, which gave him a sense of satisfaction. What stands out in Israel Keys' confession about the Courier's murder is his complete lack of remorse. Throughout the interview, he described the killings in a calm, detached manner, offering few emotional insights into what drove him to commit such heinous acts. Keys was not seeking sympathy or understanding. He simply wanted to share his version of events in the most chilling, unemotional way possible. This emotional coldness was typical of his behavior. He had no connection to his victims, and they were nothing more than objects for him to control, manipulate, and kill. His demeanor during the confession revealed how far removed he was from any sense of morality or empathy. For Israel Keys, killing was an act of self-gratification, and the suffering of his victims was secondary to his desire for control and dominance. After his confession, Keys led investigators to the location where he had burned the bodies of Bill and Lorraine Courier. They were buried in a remote area, and it took several weeks for the authorities to retrieve the bodies. The Courier family, who had endured more than a year of uncertainty, finally received the grim news that their loved ones had been brutally murdered. The discovery of the bodies provided some closure for the family, but also underscored the horror of Israel Keys' crimes. In his confession, Keys also made references to other potential victims, though many of these cases remain unsolved. His chilling statement about, quote, More bodies left investigators with the knowledge that he may have killed many more people than he had confessed to. However, due to his manipulative nature and refusal to fully cooperate, many of these cases remain open. Israel Keyes' confession about the murder of Bill and Lorraine Courier had far-reaching effects. For law enforcement, it was a pivotal moment that revealed the true extent of his crimes. His methodical planning, his ability to evade capture for so long, and his complete lack of empathy were all laid bare during his confession. For the Courier family, it brought closure and devastation. While they now knew what had happened to their loved ones, the brutality of the crime left them with a deep sense of loss. One of the most chilling aspects of Israel Keyes' criminal activities was his highly methodical approach to murder. Unlike many other serial killers who acted impulsively or who were fueled by fits of rage, Keyes' killings were planned years in advance. He would prepare for his murders by burying kill kits in various locations across the United States. These kits were hidden in remote places, often in forests or isolated rural areas, far away from his home and primary locations of operation. A kill kit consisted of tools and materials that Keyes would use when committing a murder. These kits typically contain weapons like guns, knives, and other instruments that could be used for violence or to threaten victims into submission. Rope and zip ties were on tap for restraining victims during the abduction and murder, ensuring that they were immobilized long enough to be controlled. The most important of all was money. That was a means of committing robberies or obtaining funds, often used for ransom demands, though these were typically secondary to the thrill of the murder itself. Some of his kill kits had other tools like duct tape, gloves, and cleaning supplies to remove evidence, as well as gas cans for disposal of bodies or other materials. Keyes would bury these kits in various states while traveling for work or personal reasons, often years before carrying out a murder. He was careful to hide them in locations that would make it difficult for law enforcement to trace them back to him, ensuring he remained anonymous and complicating any investigation into his crimes. The ability to plan his killings months or even years ahead of his time speaks to Keyes' chilling foresight and careful method of ensuring that he always prepared to act when the urge to kill arose. Unlike many serial killers who have specific victim types or who target people who are in close proximity to them, Keyes appeared to have no set victim profile. However, there were certain factors that influenced his choice of victim. He would target individuals who, in his eyes, seemed vulnerable or were in isolated situations. This was especially true for his choice of couples, who he seemed to find especially appealing. Keyes had a particular obsession with abducting couples. He would stalk these couples, sometimes for weeks, before making his move. His fascination with couples was rooted in a desire for power and control. He saw abducting two people at once as a way to assert dominance over both individuals, making them utterly helpless and under his complete control. For Keyes, the best victims were those who wouldn't expect danger. He would select people who were going about their daily routines, such as young women working at coffee shops or couples who were out on a hike, because he could then take them by surprise. This made it easier for him to overpower them. And Israel Keyes was highly mobile. He often traveled across country, and his choice of victims often depended on where he was at any given moment. He would kill in different states to ensure that no clear pattern emerged, making it harder for investigators to link the killings to him. Now coming towards execution, Keyes' murders were executed with a cold, methodical precision that speaks to the detachment from the suffering of his victims. His actions were not fueled by rage or emotion, but rather a calculated desire to fulfill his dark fantasies. Here are the key stages of how Keyes would carry out his murders. Keyes would often begin the process by abducting his victims, sometimes from public spaces, other times from their homes. The abduction would often be planned in advance, with Keyes studying his victims' habits and movements to ensure he could control the situation when the time came. When abducting a victim, Keyes would often begin by surprising them in a vulnerable moment. He might approach them while they are walking alone, working in a remote area, or even when they are asleep in their own homes. In many cases, he would overpower the victim using force or the threat of violence. His goal was to immobilize the victim quickly and ensure that they were too frightened or disoriented to resist. Once he had captured the victim, Keyes would use zip ties, rope, or tape to restrain them. He preferred these methods because they allowed him to bind the victim in a way that minimized the risk of escape while also ensuring that they would remain immobilized for a longer period. In many of his murders, Keyes would bind his victims in multiple ways, ensuring that they were fully incapacitated. Keyes was also a master of psychological manipulation. He would often calm his victims down by telling them that they would not be hurt if they cooperated. He would frequently use that threat of violence or the promise of a ransom to keep them compliant, though this was often a ruse and never the case. Many of his victims believed they were being held for ransom, only to find out that Keyes had no intention of releasing them. Once Keyes had his victim under control, the next phase would often involve isolating them in a secluded location where no one could hear their cries for help. He would transport them to a location far from their homes, sometimes taking them to an abandoned house or a remote area where he could execute the murder without the risk of being caught. Keyes preferred to kill his victims in a secluded location where there were no witnesses. He would often choose remote areas such as abandoned homes, forests, or even isolated camping grounds where he could commit the crime without drawing attention. He would take his time with the victim, ensuring that no one would interrupt the process. Many of Keyes' victims were killed by strangulation, a method that allowed him to maintain control over the victim while they suffered. He often used rope, wire, or other materials to strangle his victims, sometimes even leaving them alive long enough to experience the full terror of suffocation. Other times, he would use a knife to stab the victim in a random or purposeful manner, depending on how he was feeling in the moment. The use of strangulation also allowed him to prolong the victim's suffering, which seemed to give him a twisted sense of satisfaction. Israel Keyes was also known to sexually assault many of his victims before killing them. This was a consistent pattern in his crimes and appeared to be a way for him to assert further dominance over his victims. His sexual assaults were often brutal, and Keyes would sometimes describe them in detail during his confession. Keyes would sometimes take items from his victims as trophies, including personal belongings or photographs. These items were often kept as reminders of his killings. He would sometimes use these trophies as mementos, further cementing his sense of control over his victims. After the murder was complete, Keyes would take steps to dispose of the body in a way that would make it difficult for investigators to trace it back to him. His methods of disposal were as calculated as the rest of his action. In many cases, Keyes would bury the body of his victims in a remote location, often near where he had buried his kill kits. These bodies were sometimes hidden for years before they were discovered, and investigators were often unable to link the remains to Keyes. Keyes also disposed of bodies by dumping them in bodies of water. He would often drive his victims to a secluded lake or a river where he would dump the body and hope that it would be carried away or remain undetected. In some cases, Keyes would dismember the bodies of his victims, cutting them into pieces and disposing of them in different locations. This helped him further obscure the identity of his victims and made it harder for investigators to track his movements. What makes Israel Keyes' murder so chilling is his utter lack of remorse or emotional involvement in the killings. His behavior suggests a deep level of detachment from the human suffering he caused. His coldness and emotional indifference set him apart from other serial killers who often act on emotion, rage, guilt, or even pleasure in their crimes. Throughout his confessions, Keyes showed not a single remorse for his actions. He described the murders in a matter-of-fact tone, providing details without any sign of emotional distress. He expressed no regret for taking the lives of his victims and showed no empathy for the pain and grief his crime caused their families. Israel Keyes viewed his victims as objects to be manipulated, controlled, and discarded. The fact that he would go from being a seemingly normal family man to a cold-blooded killer underscores the depth of his detachment. His ability to compartmentalize his life and separate his violent actions from his everyday persona was one of the key factors in his ability to evade capture for so long. Keyes' killings seemed to provide him with a sense of thrill and excitement. He was not motivated by financial gain or any specific need, but rather a deep desire to kill. This makes his actions even more disturbing, as they were driven purely by a need to fulfill his dark urges. While Israel Keys was in prison, officials conducted a routine search of Keys' cell. They found something that would send shockwaves through law enforcement. Beneath his bed, hidden away from the eyes of his captors, they found drawings, 11 skulls, all drawn in blood. It was an eerie and disturbing scene, one that would haunt anyone who saw it. The drawings were not just crude sketches. They were meticulous, almost methodical in their execution. Each skull was marked with careful precision, drawn with a dark, reddish-brown substance. The most chilling detail? The substance was blood. Blood that, according to Keys' later confessions, was his own. But who could have imagined that the blood of a man locked away in prison would serve as the medium for such horrific reminders of his violent past? The discovery raised immediate questions. What did these skulls mean? Why had Keys drawn them? Were they a reflection of his twisted mind, or were they something more sinister? And most importantly, what were they telling us about his past crimes? The 11 skulls found beneath Keys' bed were not the random markings of a disturbed individual. They seemed to be a record, a dark ledger of the lives he had taken. Each skull was unique, yet they all shared a common theme. They were disturbing, horrifying symbols of death. The fact that they were drawn in blood only added to the terrifying significance. Blood, after all, is a symbol of life and death, the essence of life flowing through the body and its absence marking the end. For those who found the drawings, it was a stark reminder of the atrocities Israel Keys had committed over the years. But it wasn't just the imagery that was disturbing, it was the sheer organization behind it. Keys wasn't just a killer, he was a planner, a meticulous one who took great care to hide his tracks. The skulls weren't just haphazard drawings. They were a record, a catalog of his victims, a twisted map of his murderous journey. As investigators investigated through the rest of his belongings, they found that Keys had kept a detailed record of his travels, his movements, and his crimes. But it was the blood-drawn skulls that provided the most chilling insight into his mind. Each skull seemed to represent a life taken, a victim whose fate had been sealed by the hands of Keys. The question that lingered in the air, unanswered and ominous, was whether these 11 skulls were a complete list of Keys' victims or merely a fraction of the lives he had claimed. As investigators tried to make sense of the skull drawings, they began to look for patterns. 11. It wasn't just an arbitrary number. It held a certain weight, a significance that made the drawings all the more chilling. Israel Keys was known for being meticulous, for planning his crimes with a level of precision that left few traces behind. So when he drew 11 skulls in his own blood, it was likely a conscious choice. But what did the number 11 signify? At first, investigators thought it might represent the total number of victims Keys had claimed. They speculated that each skull represented one victim, with the total number being a disturbing tally of his murders. The idea was plausible, given that Keys had confessed to multiple killings across the United States, each victim seemingly chosen at random. But as they dug deeper into Keys' confession and the evidence they had gathered, a darker possibility began to emerge. Keys hinted at having more victims, possibly in other states, some of whom had never been identified. If the 11 skulls truly represented the total number of his victims, it would mean that Keys hadn't stopped killing, or that his true tally was far higher than anyone had imagined. Investigators, therefore, couldn't dismiss the possibility that the skulls were more than just a count. They might have been something more symbolic, representing Keys' twisted need to control and immortalize his victims even in death. While the 11 skulls were undeniably linked to Keys' crime, the question remained: what was the deeper meaning? Was there a specific reason why Keys had drawn exactly 11 skulls? Was it a reflection of his growing desire for recognition for his crimes to be known, even if he couldn't claim credit for them publicly? To understand the possible meaning behind the skulls, one had to look at Keys' psychology. Keys was a man of contradiction. On one hand, he was careful, methodical, and meticulous in planning his crimes. He took great pains to hide his tracks, leaving few clues behind for investigators to follow. On the other hand, he seemed to gain pleasure from the idea of his crimes being discovered, of his dark deeds being recognized. The 11 skulls could have been a manifestation of that need for acknowledgement. Each skull might have been a symbol, a declaration of his power over life and death. Another possibility is that the 11 skulls were a way for Keyes to document his murders. Not unlike a twisted form of journaling, serial killers often keep souvenirs from their crimes, items that remind them of their victims, their power, and their ability to escape justice. In Keyes' case, the blood-drawn skulls may have served as his personal record, a disturbing way to track the victims he had claimed over the years. The fact that he used his own blood to draw the skulls could signify his deep personal involvement in the murders, his complete detachment from the humanity of his victims. They were nothing more than objects to him, skulls to be drawn, lives to be extinguished. The 11 skulls could also symbolize Keyes' need for control. As a killer, he was meticulous, choosing his victims based on location rather than specific traits. For him, the thrill of the murder came from not the act itself, but from the planning, the control he held over his victims' lives. The skulls drawn in his own blood might have been a way to assert that control even in captivity. Even in prison where he was physically restrained, Keyes could still assert his dominance, still remind the world of the power he had once held over life and death. Israel Keyes had a history of killings that stretched across nearly a decade. His chilling reign of terror left investigators baffled and communities haunted behind the random nature of his actions. He spoke of the thrill he got from strangling his victims, a method that allowed him to witness the agony and loss of consciousness as they fought for their lives. He hinted at having committed many other murders over the years, some of which investigators are still trying to solve. One of these was the case of 12-year-old Julie Marie Harris, a Special Olympics medalist from Washington who disappeared in 1996. Her remains were found a year later, though the cause of death was undetermined. Keyes was questioned about the case in 2012 after his arrest, but he neither confirmed nor denied his involvement. Investigators later uncovered Keyes' admission to killing 5 people in Washington state, including an incident in which he buried or submerged a victim in a lake in Nia Bay between 2001 and 2003. In addition to the Washington murders, Keyes confessed to a double homicide between 2001 and 2005, in which he used a shovel to beat a man to death and strangled the woman. He also admitted to killing 2 other victims, one of whom was dumped in Lake Crescent, Washington. These admissions prompted investigators to review unsolved murder cases across the United States, hoping to link Keyes to any unsolved murders or missing persons cases. In 2012, they identified a possible victim, known only as Lewis County's Jane Doe, whose body was found in Morton, Washington in 2011. Though her identity was eventually discovered, her name has yet to be publicly revealed. Keyes' killing spree was not confined to just one region. He is suspected of being involved in several other murders across the United States, though many remain unlinked to him officially. One of the most infamous murders occurred in Vermont, where he flew to Chicago, rented a car, and drove 1,000 miles to carry out the crime. He prepared a murder kit years before which he would use to carry out his kills. Another notable case involves a series of crimes in Boca Raton, Florida, between 2007 and 2008, known as the Boca Killer Case. The first victim was Randy Ann Malitz Gorenberg, who was abducted from a mall parking lot in March of 2007. Her body was found shortly afterward. Keyes was linked to the other crimes in this series, including the kidnapping of a woman and her toddler, as well as the murder of Nancy Bochicchio and her daughter in December of 2007. Although there is no definitive proof connecting Keyes to these crimes, his description matched that of the suspect, and investigators remain highly suspicious of his involvement. Additionally, Keyes was connected to the 2009 disappearance of 48-year-old Deborah Fieldman, whose case was another of the many that Keyes admitted to researching online before his arrest. Federal agents showed him her photograph, and he hesitated before saying, quote, "I don't want to talk about that yet." This cryptic response fueled suspicions that Keyes was responsible for Fieldman's disappearance, though her body has never been found. Key's killing spree was not limited to the East Coast. In Texas, he was suspected of being involved in the disappearance of 58-year-old electrician James Jimmy Lamar Tidwell Jr., who vanished in February of 2012. Key's hair resembled that of the suspect seen in a bank robbery just a day after Tidwell's disappearance. Keys, when questioned about the case, claimed the wig was worn by the bank robber was actually human hair, but he gave no explanation to where it came from. This case also remains unsolved, but Keys' connection to the crime raised red flags. Keys' crimes were not limited to murder and robbery. He was also an arsonist. His first act of arson was in Colville, Washington, where he set fire to a trailer. He was later a suspect in the deaths of Cassandra Cassie Emerson and her mother, Marlene K. Emerson, in 1997. However, in 2024, another suspect was arrested for the murders, clearing Keys' name from that case. Although Keys was never officially linked to all the murders he confessed to, his reign of terror left an indelible mark on the investigators who tried to track him down. His ability to carefully plan his murders, avoid detection, and cover his tracks made him one of the most elusive serial killers in modern history. His chilling confessions, combined with his disturbing patterns and random victim selection, makes him a case study in the minds of law enforcement agencies trying to understand the mind of a killer who went undetected for years. But what made Israel Keys the way he was? Well, it has a history, and we have to go into his childhood to know more about this. Israel Keys' life began on January 7, 1978 in Richmond, Utah, the second of 10 children born to Heidi and John Jeffrey Jeff Keys. The family was deeply rooted in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, a faith that would significantly shape Israel's early worldviews. However, as his life unfolded, Keys' upbringing would deviate dramatically from the idealized version of Mormonism that his parents had initially envisioned. The Keys family's first years in Utah were relatively conventional, adhering closely to the religious practice of the LDS Church. But by 1983, when Israel was 5, the family made a radical decision that would ultimately play a pivotal role in Israel's life. They left LDS Church. His father's growing disillusionment with the faith marked the beginning of their descent into extremism. They moved to a remote area in Colville, Washington, where the isolation was extreme. The family lived in a one-room cabin without electricity or running water in the woods of Rocky Creek Road, surrounded by towering pines and miles away from the nearest neighbor. The decision, driven by the father's bitterness toward the LDS Church, set the family on a course of isolation and self-reliance. Israel, like his siblings, grew up in a household that removed itself from mainstream society. The family's decision to live off the grid was not simply a lifestyle choice. It was a response to their belief that modern life was corrupt and dangerous. In this isolated environment, Keys learned early on that solitude could be a sanctuary but also a prison. At such a tender age, Israel began to experience a reality that was far removed from the norm. The family's absence from modern technology and socializing in a religious community removed him from schoolmates and friends, though he would later describe his time at school as isolating. His formative years would instill an increasing sense of alienation, a feeling that would grow as he moved into adolescence. As the family lived in this seclusion, they became entrenched in extreme religious ideology. They attended a church called the Ark, which adhered to white supremacist Christian identity beliefs, a doctrine known for its violence and racial intolerance. This ideology served to further distort Israel's perception of society and people who were different. His formative years, in many ways, were infused with a philosophy that dehumanized others and justified violence as a form of control. These beliefs, compounded by a lack of empathy instilled by his parents and his isolated upbringings, contributed heavily to the development of his antisocial tendencies. In these early years, the Keys family proximity to Chevy Kehoe, a man later convicted of a triple murder, would become indirect, yet significantly influenced. This connection exposed Israel to a more extreme form of violent ideology, one that embraced the idea of social collapse and violent retribution against those deemed, quote, undesirable. These associations are believed to have fueled the growing resentment and violent fantasies that Keyes would later act upon in adulthood. As Israel reached his teenage years, his world became even darker. At age 14, he was already alienated from his peers, growing to 6 feet 2 inches tall. Israel was an imposing figure, but it wasn't just his physical size that distanced him from others. It was the darkness within him. He began to harbor thoughts and impulses that others his age did not understand. Keyes was deeply isolated, not just from his family, but from society as a whole. His behaviors during this time were increasingly concerning. Keyes began to indulge in destructive activities, such as shooting at neighbors' homes with a BB gun, setting fires in the woods, and breaking into homes. These early crimes, while seemingly unimportant, were indicative of a deeper need for control and disregard for the sanctity of others' property. But it wasn't just a petty crime. Keyes also began to experiment with more sinister behaviors. He tortured animals, and one of the most chilling incidents involved him tying a cat to a tree with a parachute cord and shooting it with a .22 revolver. This behavior deeply disturbed the children who witnessed it, but it was particularly telling in Keyes' case, as he seemed to enjoy getting pleasure from the animal's suffering. Keyes himself later reflected on these early acts, noting that they were both forms of power and an escape from the feeling of helplessness that plagued him. His family's response to these behaviors was to punish him and impose stricter controls, but their reactions were hardly effective in controlling his increasingly dangerous tendencies. His parents also discovered a cache of stolen guns that Israel had hidden, further cementing the image of him as someone who was already experimenting with criminal activities. By this time, Israel had developed his own worldview. He viewed people as either weak or beneath him. In fact, his early journals documented some of his thoughts, filled with biblical quotations, but also confessions of shame for acts that he now considered normal, like lusting after his girlfriend. His self-loathing created an internal tension that only heightened his sense of alienation. Eventually, his growing negative attitude toward religion led him to renounce his Christian faith after a fierce argument with his parents. His rejection of faith became a crucial turning point. He no longer needed to please others, and his mind turned to darker avenues. At this point, Keyes was fully on the path towards antisocial behavior. He turned away from his family and increasingly isolated himself from society. This period was marked by a rejection of the normal society and the embrace of darker ideologies. Keyes became fascinated with Satanism, believing it would allow him to indulge in his most violent and sadistic urges without consequences. His desire for ritualistic murder began to take shape, and though he never carried through on this impulse at the time, it marked the first real indication of his thirst for power and control over life and death. By the time Keyes reached adulthood, his criminal activities began to escalate, transitioning from petty thefts and animal cruelty to serious violent offenses. In the summer of 1997 or 1998, while living in Oregon, Keyes' escalated violence led to the sexual assault of a teenage girl. The victim had been relaxing tubing in a river in Oregon when Keyes, lying in wait, ambushed her, dragging her from her tube and assaulting her violently. He initially planned to kill her as part of his Satan ritual, but something inside him faltered. "I was too timid. I wasn't violent enough," he later admitted. "I made up in my mind I was never going to let that happen again." This experience, as chilling as it was, would serve as a formative moment for Keyes. It marked his first encounter with hesitation, and more importantly, it shaped his resolve to never again falter in carrying out the violent acts that had been stewing inside him for years. Keyes had developed a desire to kill, to inflict terror. But this incident also reveals something crucial. He was not as ruthless as he wanted to be. From that point on, he vowed to embrace violence fully and never again let the opportunity to exert power over others slip by. In 1998, Keyes enlisted in the U.S. Army, likely to escape the stifling confines of his family life and to gain structure that could potentially mask his violent tendencies. He was stationed in Fort Lewis, Washington, and later Fort Hood, where he served in the 25th Infantry Division. In the Army, Keyes served with distinction in the Motors Division, and his training as a specialist gave him access to skills that would later be valuable in his later criminal activities. But even in this highly disciplined environment, Keyes exhibited behaviors that were out of sync with those of his fellow soldiers. His quiet, withdrawn nature made him seem like a loner, and though he kept to himself, his violent thoughts and impulses continued to simmer under the surface. One fellow soldier even noted that Keyes had once confided that he would like to kill him. It was clear that his violent tendencies were never far from the surface, but his ability to control them was deteriorating. During his time in the military, Keyes struggled with alcoholism, often consuming entire bottles of Wild Turkey bourbon on weekends. His mood swings, coupled with his growing distrust, began to affect his relationship with others. Despite this, he excelled in his military duties, receiving the Army Achievement Medal for his performance. This period of Keyes' life marked a critical point in his evolution. The Army provided him with both resources and a sense of detachment, and for the first time, Keyes began to experience life outside the extreme isolation that had dominated his upbringing. However, instead of gaining a sense of belonging or peace, the military experience only amplified his need for control and disassociation from humanity. In 2001, Keyes was discharged from the U.S. Army after serving a stint that saw him stationed in several places, including Egypt and Israel. It was during his time in the military that Keyes reportedly started engaging in serious criminal behavior, though he was careful to keep these actions under wraps. In fact, while in the Army, Keyes never confessed to any murders. Yet he did admit to committing other crimes. These included attempting to rape a worker while stationed in Egypt and a college student in Israel, both of which raised concerns about his ability to control his violent urges. He also confessed to a series of bank robberies, including one in New York and another in Texas, which confirmed his involvement in multiple criminal activities beyond murder. Authorities later verified that he had indeed robbed a community bank branch in Tupper Lake, New York in April of 2009, along with several other robberies and home burglaries across the United States. While these crimes began to paint a picture of a man willing to use violence for personal gain, it was only after the military discharge in 2001 that Keyes would fully embrace his true nature as a killer. His first known murders began shortly after leaving the Army, and they followed a pattern of meticulous planning and careful execution. By 2007, Israel Keyes had returned to civilian life in Alaska, where he started a construction business named Keyes Construction. He was respected as a skilled contractor, but something darker was at play. Keyes began to see Alaska as a vast hunting ground, a place where he could hide in plain sight. He was known for being quiet, yet there were disturbing rumors about him. Female clients reported feeling uneasy around him, noting that his dark moods and disquieting facial expressions made them feel uncomfortable. Keyes' move to Alaska served as a turning point in his criminal career. Alaska's remote landscape, with their sprawling wilderness and isolated locations, provided the perfect cover for a serial killer to operate. His unassuming life in the small town of Anchorage provided him with the freedom to commit his crimes without drawing attention. By this time, Keyes was in complete control of his life, having shed the remnants of his earlier family and military affiliations. During his time in Alaska, Keyes also established ties to New York, where he owned land and a rundown cabin. Investigators believe that this property may have been used as a base for future killings, potentially adding more victims to his already growing list of murder targets. His ability to remain under the radar was a testament to his cunning and his desire for control. At this point, Keyes had fully embraced his role as a predator, living in the shadows and operating without remorse. Another thing about Israel Keyes revealed in the investigation was that he was fascinated with serial killers. He was particularly drawn to serial killers like Ted Bundy, Dennis Rader, and Robert Hansen, all of whom had one thing in common. They were methodical, calculated, and terrifyingly successful at evading capture for years. Keyes didn't just see them as criminals, he saw them as role models. Bundy's ability to charm and deceive, Rader's meticulous planning, and Hansen's knowledge of the land, all of it fascinated Keyes. He wanted to emulate their success, but do it better, smarter, and more efficiently. Keyes didn't just passively read about these killers, he studied them. He had a collection of books that detailed the lives and crimes of serial killers, both fiction and non-fiction. One of his favorites was Dean Koontz' Intensity. The book featured a killer who is just as meticulous and controlled as Keyes imagined himself to be. Keyes read it multiple times and found that he identified with the antagonist, the killer who was calculating, patient, and terrifying. This was a clear signal that Keyes was forming an identity around being a predator, someone who was always several steps ahead. But his fascination with serial killers wasn't just limited to the books he read. He also admired the idea of being anonymous, of leaving no trace, and of never being caught. Keyes looked up to those who managed to commit crimes and disappear without anyone ever suspecting them. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. In fact, he actively shunned media attention. While others would revel in the spotlight, Keyes feared being labeled a copycat. He didn't want to be known as someone who was just repeating the crimes of others. He wanted to be original, and in his mind, that meant staying in the shadows, avoiding attention, and leaving no trace. In fact, he was quite vocal about his disdain for serial killers who had been caught. Dennis Rader, the infamous BTK killer, was one such killer that Keyes mocked, even though he studied him. After he had been captured by police, what frustrated Keyes the most was Rader's apology in court. Keyes saw that as a sign of weakness. He couldn't understand why someone would apologize for committing murder. He thought it made Rader look like a wimp. In Keyes' mind, serial killers should never show remorse, and the fact that Rader did made him a failure in Keyes' eyes. While Keyes admired Ted Bundy's cunning and Robert Hanson's skill at blending into the landscape, it's clear that Keyes' admiration was based on more than just their criminal prowess. It was about control. It was about being in charge of the situation, choosing your victims, and executing a plan with flawless precision. He wanted to be like them, methodical, untouchable, and unseen. And to a degree, he succeeded in his plan. Keyes was obsessed with studying serial killers so much that he didn't stop to realize that he too was following a well-worn path. Serial killers, no matter how smart or how careful they are, make mistakes. Eventually, the truth catches up with them. This obsession also meant that Keyes had a twisted hobby. He kept up with ongoing criminal investigation. For instance, when the 2012 Aurora, Colorado shooting happened, Keyes didn't just ignore it like most people would. Instead, he was curious about the shooter. He asked about the status of James Holmes, the shooter, not because he wanted to help in any way, but because he was fascinated by the violence and the crime. It wasn't about the victims or the tragedies for Keyes. It was about the act itself, the terror it caused, the chaos it unleashed. For him, it was just another piece of the puzzle he was trying to figure out. But what's even more chilling is how Keyes openly talked about other serial killers. He was especially interested in Robert Hansen, another Alaskan killer who had been active for years and was able to hide in plain sight. When Keyes asked about Hansen, he didn't just say he knew about him, he responded enthusiastically. Keyes didn't just know the names of serial killers, he knew their stories, inside and out. It was his hobby. He said, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about." This wasn't just casual knowledge, it was an obsession. Keyes' fascination with other killers wasn't just about their methods, it was about their elusiveness. He wanted to be like them, untouchable, undetected, and in control. He studied everything from the geography of their killings to the timing of their crimes, trying to learn from their mistakes. He took notes, observed patterns, and developed a mental framework for how he was going to execute his own crimes. His whole criminal philosophy revolved around the idea of getting away with murder, something he had learned from his idols like Bundy and Hansen. This obsession led him to seemingly ordinary interactions with people. That was Keyes at his core, detached, cold, and consumed by his twisted intellectual curiosity. But here's the thing that's so disturbing. For all his admirations of other killers, for all the books he read, and the strategies he studied, Keyes was far from the calculating mastermind he believed himself to be. Serial killers like Ted Bundy had been captured because of their ego, their overconfidence, and their mistakes. Keyes, despite being intelligent and cautious, fell into the same trap. He thought he was better, smarter, and more in control than anyone who came before him. But in the end, it was his obsession with control and perfection that led to his downfall. Keyes thought he could be the ultimate serial killer, the one who never got caught, the one who was always several steps ahead. But serial killers, no matter how meticulous, always make a mistake. And for Keyes, his mistake came in the form of his own arrogance. He believed he could outsmart the system, outwit the investigators, and remain hidden for the rest of his life. In the end, though, his obsession with his idols and his own need for perfection became his undoing. Keyes' obsession with serial killers wasn't just a hobby. It was a dangerous compulsion that shaped his entire life and eventual criminal career. He studied them to understand their mistakes, to learn from them, but to also emulate them. His admiration for these figures was rooted not in desire to understand them, but in a need to be them. He wanted to prove he could do it better, that he could succeed where others had failed. And that obsession, that constant drive for perfection, led him to commit acts of unspeakable horror and eventually to his capture. Through all his studying, his preparation, and his careful planning, one thing remained true. Israel Keyes was not as invincible as he believed. Serial killers, no matter how skilled, always leave behind traces, always make mistakes. And while Keyes tried desperately to avoid detection, his obsession ultimately became his greatest flaw. He thought he could outrun justice, but in the end, it caught up with him just like it does for all serial killers. The Samantha Koenig murder proved to be the final nail in the coffin of Israel Keyes' criminal empire. It was the moment that would ultimately unravel his meticulously crafted life of secrecy and expose the full scope of the twisted darkness that had consumed him for years. But while Samantha's abduction and murder led to Keyes' eventual capture, it was his final days in custody that would reveal just how much he had prepared for his own end. Keyes had been arrested in March of 2012, a quiet, methodical man who showed little remorse for his crimes. He knew what he had done. The FBI knew what he had done. They had him in custody. But there was something deeply unsettling about Israel Keyes. It was as though he had always planned his capture and prepared for the inevitable downfall. Keyes was an expert at controlling his environment. And now behind the bars of a high-security correctional facility, he would still manage to maintain control over one final detail: the way he would die. For months, the FBI interrogated him, drawing out piece after piece of information about his crimes, his methods, and his motives. Keyes has spoken openly about his murders, but the real question was, how many more victims had he claimed that no one knew about? The FBI had pieced together a horrifying timeline of his killings based on his confessions and the evidence they had gathered, but there was always holes in the story, missing pieces that Keyes never fully revealed. A man who had been so careful in his planning, so meticulous in his execution, was now faced with the consequences of his actions. He was no longer in control of his own life. He was no longer the predator stalking his prey. Instead, he was now just a man who had been captured, waiting for his fate to be sealed. Keyes wasn't the type to just sit by and let life run its course. He had spent years learning from other killers, studying their mistakes, perfecting his own methods, and living by the motto of never being caught. And in the end, it seemed that he would choose to control his own death just as he controlled every other aspect of his life. Prison authorities were well aware of Keyes' potential for self-harm. They had placed him under security restrictions, meaning that he was only allowed to use an electric razor under supervision. Keyes' movements were closely monitored, and his cell was stripped of anything that could potentially be used as a weapon. It seemed as though everything had been accounted for. And yet, Israel Keyes found a way to obtain something far more dangerous than any other weapon: a razor blade. How Keyes managed to smuggle a razor blade into his cell remains a mystery. Was it a lapse in the system? Did he have help from the outside? Or had he simply found a way to conceal the blade during one of his many interactions with the outside world? The truth may never be fully known, but one thing was certain: he was prepared. Keyes had been waiting for his moment, biding his time in a way that only a true predator could. On the night of December 1st, 2012, Israel Keyes chose to end his own life. In a way, it wasn't a surprise. For a man who had spent his life evading capture, avoiding the consequences of his actions, it made sense that he would eventually try to regain some semblance of control over his own demise. The details of his death were as chilling as the rest of his life. He began by cutting open his wrist with the razor blade, allowing the blood to flow freely from his body. But the self-inflicted wounds weren't enough to end his life. Israel Keyes, ever the perfectionist, had a backup plan. After slashing his wrists, he tied a bedsheet around his neck and used it to strangle himself. His method was calculated, designed to ensure that his death would be his final act. In fact, the way he arranged his body, lying on his stomach, his wrist still bleeding with the sheet wrapped tightly around his neck, was a clear indication that he had carefully thought through every step of the process. When the prison guards came to check on him the next morning, they found Israel Keyes dead, his body sprawled out of his cell. There was no immediate outpouring of emotion, no screaming or chaos, just the cold, clinical reality of his death, the culmination of a life spent evading justice, only to take control of his own fate in the end. His death was, in a way, the final act of defiance, the last move in a game that had consumed him for years. But Keyes didn't leave behind just his body and a trail of questions. He had one final act of deception to perform, a suicide note. Beneath his lifeless body was a note that would give investigators a final, chilling glimpse into his warped mind. The note was an ode to murder, a disturbing reflection of the man he had been. It wasn't a confession or an apology. It was a final piece of his twisted legacy. And while it did not provide any direct clues about other victims, it offered an unsettling window into the mindset of a killer who never regretted his action. Keyes' final days and his death left behind more questions than answers. His suicide wasn't a confession, but it was a signal of his need for control. He chose the timing, the method, and even the way he would leave his mark on the world. And in his final moments, he left behind a trail of blood drawings and cryptic messages, a final twisted riddle that would haunt investigators for years to come. In the end, Israel Keyes may have succeeded in his twisted goal of never fully being caught. He had taken his own life, evading the trial and the justice that might have come for him. But his legacy, like the victims he left behind, would never truly fade. The questions about his murders, the number of his victims, and the full extent of his crimes is still lingering.
If you found value in this documentary and want to help support future investigations like this, I've set up a Patreon. There's no obligation. This channel will always remain free, but it's there for those who want to support the work or help decide future cases. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.